She sprayed mud water on her unaware. She was her fiancé's mother. She raised the bucket and sprayed the mud water without hesitation, right on the old woman's face. Not knowing the woman kneeling before her wasn't a beggar, but her fiancé's mother. The old woman didn't fight back, didn't shout. She only wiped her face slowly and whispered an apology that broke something unseen. The young woman laughed. She thought power meant humiliation. She thought love had already secured her future. She didn't know someone else was watching from a distance, someone who recognized that voice, that face, that dignity.
He wasn't supposed to be there that day.
She never imagined he'd see what she did. He believed he was about to marry a kind, respectable woman. But the moment the muddy water hit his mother's face, everything he believed collapsed. Now he's not just a man in love. He's a son standing at a crossroads. Expose the woman he planned to marry, or stay silent and betray the woman who gave him life. Either way, the wedding will never be the same again. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ocean of Tales. Kindly watch, comment, and subscribe on this channel. We'll be grateful if you help us do this. We will be notifying you when we drop a new video. Don't forget to tell us where you are watching from. Before we move to the main story, if today is your first time of watching our video, please subscribe. The bucket lifted slowly, heavy with thick brown water that smelled of rust, earth, and gutter runoff, its weight pulling the woman's arm downward before she steadied herself and swung. The splash hit skin with a wet slap, mud exploding across the old woman's face, clinging to her lashes, soaking into her wrapper, dripping down her chin like shame made liquid. A ripple of laughter rolled through the small crowd gathered along the roadside in Lagos, sharp and careless, as if cruelty were entertainment. The sun burned overhead, bright and unforgiving, catching every detail, the streaks of mud, the tremor in the old woman's hands, the satisfied tilt of a thrower's chin. Phones hovered. Whispers bloomed. No one moved to help. In that suspended second, the world seemed to agree that this was allowed, that power had chosen its side. But as the mud slid downward and pooled at the old woman's feet, something invisible cracked in the air, and the question hung heavy: who had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? The old woman sank lower, knees pressing into warm asphalt, breath shallow as she wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve, slow and careful, like a ritual learned from years of restraint. The crowd leaned in, curious now, waiting for anger, for curses, for the kind of reaction that would justify the laughter. Instead, silence came, thick, stubborn, humiliating in its calm. The woman's shoulders rose and fell as she steadied herself, lips moving as if counting something only she could see. The city noise surged around her, horns, distant generators, a vendor shouting prices, but none of it reached her face. She bowed her head, not in defeat, but in control, and murmured an apology so soft it seemed to fall inward rather than out. That unexpected gentleness unsettled the watchers, turning their smiles brittle. If she would not rage, what were they supposed to feel? And if she refused to fight back, what truth was she protecting by staying silent? The woman holding the bucket, Vanessa Adebayo, shifted her weight and laughed again, louder this time, as if to remind everyone who owned the moment. Her clothes were clean, her hair perfect, her confidence polished by the approval of onlookers who mistook boldness for strength. She spoke with ease, words sharp and careless, performing for the small audience, like a star on a tiny stage. This was how she won rooms, by controlling the temperature, by making others smaller, by turning humiliation into proof of authority. She had learned early that kindness was optional when power was present. The mud on the ground pleased her. It felt like punctuation. She glanced around to measure reactions, savoring the nods, the chuckles, the subtle retreat of those who knew better than to intervene. She never looked twice at the woman kneeling before her. Why would she? In Vanessa's world, respect followed status, not humanity. But beneath the applause of the moment lurked a dangerous blind spot, and the question pressed forward: what happens when power misjudges who is watching? Heat shimmered off the road as the old woman straightened her spine, inch by inch, dignity assembled like armor from scraps. Her eyes lifted, not to Vanessa, but past her, toward the street where life continued without pause. There was history in those eyes, a depth that did not belong to beggars or strangers, a quiet strength shaped by endurance. She brushed mud from her cheek and adjusted her wrapper, hands steady despite the tremble in her wrists. The crowd noticed, then really noticed, the way she carried herself, the way shame refused to stick. A few murmurs softened. Someone coughed. A phone lowered. Still, no one spoke. Lagos teaches people to mind their business, to survive by distance. The old woman rose halfway, knees protesting, and paused, as if listening for something far away. Perhaps a memory. Perhaps a promise. Perhaps a footstep. The air tightened with anticipation, because silence that deep always means something is coming. And somewhere beyond the circle of watchers, was someone already moving closer? Traffic hissed as a black SUV slowed at the edge of the crowd, windows tinted against the sun, its presence unnoticed at first amid the noise and tension. The vehicle idled, engine low and patient, as if waiting for the right moment to breathe. Inside, a man leaned forward, gaze narrowing, drawn by the shape of stillness at the center of chaos. He arrived earlier than planned, detoured by instinct rather than schedule, and now the scene tugged at him with an ache he couldn't place.
The mud.
The laughter. The kneeling figure. Something about the posture felt familiar, like a memory refusing to stay buried. He opened the door and stepped into the heat, shoes meeting asphalt, heart beating faster with each step. The crowd shifted without understanding why. A voice, soft, dignified, floated toward him, and recognition sparked, sharp and immediate. The world tilted as his breath caught. Had he just heard the voice that raised him? Vanessa basked in the attention, unaware of the shift behind her, unaware that the temperature of the moment had changed. She gestured broadly, words spilling with confidence, while the old woman's silence grew louder by contrast. The crowd's energy wavered, laughter thinning into uneasy smiles. A few people turned, sensing movement, sensing consequence. The man from the SUV took another step forward, eyes fixed on the kneeling figure, chest tightening as details snapped into place. The curve of the shoulders, the familiar way she wiped her face, the restraint that had always defined her. His jaw clenched. Time stretched thin. The city noise dimmed. Vanessa's certainty shone bright and brittle, seconds away from shattering. And as the man crossed into the open, would anyone stop what was already unfolding? The old woman finally looked up, eyes meeting the distance with calm resolve, as if she had known this moment would come and had prepared for it in silence. The crowd held its breath. Vanessa shifted, irritated by the pause, unaware that the stage beneath her feet was about to collapse. The man stepped fully into view, sunlight catching his face, and the space between them closed with every heartbeat. Mud dried on skin. Laughter died on lips. The road, the crowd, the city, all seemed to lean inward. A truth hovered, heavy and unavoidable, waiting for its name. And just before it could be spoken, the tension snapped tight, leaving only one burning question to pull us forward. What happens when cruelty meets blood? Morning light slid across the roadside earlier that day, pale and hesitant, revealing the old woman long before the crowd formed around her. She arrived quietly, feet dusty from walking too far, wrapper faded from years of careful washing, posture straight despite the ache in her joints. She chose a spot near the curb where people passed without seeing, lowering herself slowly as if the ground were an old acquaintance. Lagos moved fast around her, heels clicking, engines growling, voices trading prices and insults, but she stayed still, eyes alert, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't begging. She wasn't lost. She was waiting, studying faces, listening to laughter float from nearby shops, searching for a familiar cadence in a city that rarely slowed for anyone. The heat climbed, sweat gathered at her temples, and still she waited, patience honed by decades of endurance. Anyone who looked closely might have noticed the way she held herself, the dignity that refused to bend. But no one looked closely. And in a city that prizes motion over meaning, what chance did a quiet woman have of being seen? She shifted slightly as the sun rose higher, eyes following a group of women passing by, their conversation sharp with gossip and plans. Names floated past her ears, half heard, half remembered, and one of them made her heart lift with a small, dangerous hope. She had traveled to Lagos for this, spent the last of her savings on transport, rehearsed her courage during sleepless nights, whispered prayers to steady her resolve. She wanted to see the woman her son loved, to feel the shape of her character, without introductions or ceremony. Years had taught her that titles and promises hid too much. Character lived in small moments, in how power treated vulnerability. So she stayed silent, letting the day unfold around her, trusting instinct over comfort. Hunger gnawed, but she ignored it. Fear fluttered, but she pressed it down. If this was to be a test, it had to be honest. She believed truth revealed itself when people thought no one important was watching. And as footsteps approached and shadows lengthened, would this city show her what she needed to know? Memories crowded in as she waited, uninvited and relentless. She remembered holding a feverish child through the night, fanning him with cardboard when the power failed, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. She remembered scrubbing floors until her knuckles cracked, selling jewelry piece by piece to pay school fees, choosing sacrifice without applause. Those memories steadied her now, grounding her in purpose. She had raised a man who valued kindness, who spoke gently, who promised a future built on respect. That promise was why she sat here, enduring stares and indifference, determined to understand the woman who would share his life. The city didn't know her story, didn't care. To them, she was just another tired face by the roadside. But inside her chest, love burned bright and stubborn, refusing to dim. She breathed slowly, letting that love guide her gaze as footsteps finally stopped nearby. And as voices rose and attention shifted toward her corner of the street, what reflection of her son's world would she be forced to face? Vanessa's presence arrived like a change in weather, sudden, commanding, impossible to ignore. The old woman sensed it before she saw it, a tightening in the air, a ripple of attention bending toward one person. She kept her head bowed, observing from the edges, noting the confidence in Vanessa's stride, the ease with which others made space. Power announces itself without words. The old woman understood that language well. She studied the young woman's shoes, the way they avoided puddles, the way her laughter landed hard and fast, as if daring anyone to challenge it. This, she realized, was the moment she had come for, the unguarded intersection of status and circumstance. She waited, hands still, heart steady, giving the scene room to reveal itself. But as the attention sharpened and the energy around her shifted from indifference to amusement, a familiar warning stirred inside her. Experience whispered that cruelty often arrived dressed as confidence. And when eyes finally turned toward her, would mercy follow, or something far darker? The crowd formed quickly, drawn by the promise of spectacle the way moths gather around light. Someone laughed. Someone nudged another. Phones appeared. The old woman felt the circle tighten, felt herself reduced to a focal point she never asked to be. She remained still, refusing to perform desperation, refusing to beg for space. She had learned long ago that survival sometimes meant silence, that dignity could be louder than protest. Her gaze lifted just enough to take in faces. Curious, entertained, detached. None of them knew why she was here. None of them cared. She swallowed hard, steadying herself as words brushed past her like heat. The city's rhythm pulsed, indifferent to her heartbeat. Yet beneath the noise, a deeper tension coiled, waiting for release. She sensed it the way mothers sense danger, an instinct sharpened by loss and love. And as the first sharp gesture cut through the air, would she be able to endure what came next without breaking? Mud splashed nearby as someone shifted a bucket, the smell thick and metallic, and the old woman's chest tightened. She glanced up briefly, eyes meeting Vanessa's for the first time, searching for humanity in the moment before impact. For a fraction of a second, something flickered, curiosity, perhaps, or irritation, but not empathy. The old woman lowered her gaze again, choosing restraint, choosing faith in a truth not yet revealed. Her hands curled slightly in her lap, nails pressing into skin, grounding herself against the coming storm. She told herself that whatever happened, she would remain who she was. She would not let cruelty define her. The crowd leaned in, anticipation buzzing like static. And as the bucket rose, heavy and deliberate, who would remember this moment when consequences came calling? After the splash, after the laughter, after the silence that followed, the old woman stayed where she was, absorbing the moment like a blow meant to test her balance. She wiped her face slowly, refusing to rush, refusing to give the crowd the reaction it wanted. Her calm unsettled them more than anger ever could. She adjusted her wrapper, straightened her back, and breathed through the sting in her eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a familiar presence stirred, close enough to feel, yet unseen. She sensed movement beyond the circle, a shift in energy that prickled her skin. The city seemed to hold its breath with her. She did not know how this would end, only that it would not remain hidden. And as she lifted her eyes toward the street once more, the unspoken question pressed forward, sharp and urgent. How long can truth stay invisible before it demands to be seen? Vanessa learned early how to read rooms the way others read books, entering with a smile already calibrated for approval, posture tuned to command attention without asking for it. She moved through Lagos like the city owed her space, heels clicking with certainty, eyes trained to skim over people she didn't need. Kindness, to her, was a costume, worn when cameras were near, removed when power felt secure. She laughed easily, spoke softly in public, and collected praise the way others collected debts. No one questioned her warmth because it arrived on time and looked convincing. But beneath that polish lived a careful hunger, a need to be seen as superior, untouchable. She had learned that control felt safer than empathy, that dominance prevented disappointment. And as she basked in the moment by the roadside, she believed she was winning again. Yet every performance carries a flaw, a seam that can split when pressure is applied. And in that bright heat, what truth was straining to tear through her perfect act? She had practiced this version of herself for years, at church, at family gatherings, in offices where reputations were traded like currency. She knew when to kneel, when to bow, when to praise elders with just enough humility to be admired. It worked because people wanted to believe it. They wanted a story where success wore good manners and beauty came with virtue. Vanessa fed that desire expertly, offering charm instead of substance, smiles instead of accountability. Love, for her, was another role, another arrangement built on optics and outcomes. She never considered how her partner's values might test her in moments without witnesses. Why would she? She assumed love was secure once promises were made, once status aligned. The roadside felt private enough, insignificant enough, to reveal her unfiltered self. The laughter, the bucket, the silence, it all felt justified. But when love is built on performance, the smallest crack can expose everything. And as the crowd shifted uneasily, who would be left applauding when the mask slipped? Her resentment ran deeper than she admitted, shaped by years of comparison and quiet envy. She measured herself against others constantly. Who wore better clothes, who drove nicer cars, who commanded more respect. Those beneath her became targets, reminders of what she had escaped or feared becoming. The old woman by the roadside represented everything Vanessa refused to acknowledge: vulnerability, age, dependence. In humiliating her, Vanessa felt momentarily powerful, as if erasing a reflection she didn't want to see. The approval of onlookers fueled that feeling, turning cruelty into validation. She didn't ask why the woman was there, didn't wonder what story hid behind the silence. Curiosity had no place in her hierarchy. But cruelty always leaves residue, a tension that clings to the air. And as murmurs replaced laughter, what part of Vanessa's own insecurity had just been laid bare? She glanced around again, reading faces, recalibrating as unease crept in. Some smiles faded. A phone lowered. The energy shifted from entertainment to discomfort, and Vanessa felt it like a change in pressure. She doubled down, voice firmer, posture sharper, unwilling to surrender control. When power feels threatened, it often grows louder. She gestured, emphasizing her point, eyes flashing with confidence that bordered on defiance. She believed dominance would drown out, that boldness could overwrite conscience. The old woman's refusal to react gnawed at her more than anger would have. Silence offered no leverage. It forced reflection, and reflection was dangerous. Vanessa pushed it away, focusing on the crowd, the moment, the sense of command. But beneath her certainty, a flicker of awareness stirred. Something wasn't aligning the way it should. And as she searched for reassurance in the faces around her, why did the ground suddenly feel less stable beneath her feet? Her phone buzzed at her bag, ignored. The city's noise surged, dismissed. Vanessa was anchored to the now, convinced this was just another scene she controlled. She thought of the life she was building, the future already planned, the ring waiting to be worn. Love, she believed, would forgive this. Love would understand context, excuse excess, prioritize loyalty over morality. She had seen it happen before. People chose comfort over truth all the time. The old woman's dignity felt like an obstacle, an unexpected resistance that threatened her narrative. Vanessa scoffed inwardly, dismissing the discomfort as fleeting. She had learned to outrun consequences with confidence. But consequences have a way of waiting, patient and precise. And as the heat pressed down and the crowd held its breath, how close was she to a reckoning she could no longer escape? The laughter finally died completely, replaced by a hush that made Vanessa's skin prickle. She noticed it then, the way people shifted, the way eyes drifted past her shoulder towards something unseen. Irritation flared. She hated losing focus, hated not being the center. She turned slightly, ready to reclaim attention, unaware that the axis of the moment had already moved. Power was no longer hers alone. The old woman remained still, eyes calm, as if waiting for a cue only she could hear. Vanessa felt a pulse of unease she couldn't name, a sensation she quickly buried beneath bravado. She straightened, prepared to speak again, to reassert control. But before she could, a presence cut through the circle, altering the balance entirely. And in that narrowing space, whose version of love was about to be tested, hers, or the one she never bothered to understand. As Vanessa opened her mouth, the city seemed to lean inward, sound dimming, anticipation sharpening. The performance she relied on faltered, just for a second, revealing the fear underneath. Love built on lies cannot survive truth's arrival. It cracks under the weight of reality. The old woman's eyes lifted once more, steady and knowing, while Vanessa's confidence wavered. Somewhere behind her, footsteps approached, deliberate and unmistakable. The story she thought she controlled was slipping beyond her grasp. And as the distance closed and the moment of revelation crept closer, one question burned brighter than the rest. What happens when love is finally forced to show its true foundation? Years earlier, Dawn used to find Mama Ruth awake before the city breathed, kneeling on cool concrete floors with a broom in her hands and prayer on her lips. She worked in borrowed spaces, other people's homes, other people's lives, cleaning what they left behind and carrying her hopes in quiet pockets. Each sweep of the broom was deliberate, each movement a promise to the child still asleep on a thin mattress back home. Hunger followed her like a shadow, but she learned to outrun it with purpose. She measured days in small victories, paid fees, bought books, a meal stretched far enough. No one applauded those moments. They didn't need to. Love kept its own record. And as she bent under the weight of those memories now, kneeling by the roadside, how many unseen sacrifices had paved the road that led her here. The years blurred into routines that demanded everything and gave little back. Mama Ruth sold jewelry piece by piece, each sale a quiet goodbye to a dream she never voiced. She learned to laugh softly so her child wouldn't hear the strain, to sleep lightly in case illness came calling. When neighbors whispered about her choices, she lowered her head and kept moving. She believed resilience was built in silence, that complaints weakened the work of love. Even when the city felt cold, she held warmth inside her chest, saving it for the future she imagined for her son. She taught him kindness by example, showing him how to greet elders, how to share what little he had, how to stand tall without stepping on others. Those lessons traveled with him as he grew, invisible but steady. And now, as she wiped mud from her face, which of those lessons was about to be tested? Distance grew as success arrived, stretching the space between mother and son in ways neither fully understood. Calls became shorter, visits rarer. Not because love faded, but because life accelerated. Mama Ruth accepted the distance without complaint, trusting that purpose sometimes required absence. She watched from afar as his world expanded, new circles, new expectations, new pressures. She remained anchored to her place, content to be the root rather than the branch. She never asked for recognition, never demanded access to the life she helped build. Mothers, she believed, existed to prepare children for worlds they might never enter themselves. That belief kept her quiet even when loneliness pressed in. And as she knelt there now, choosing restraint over exposure, was silence still protection, or had it become a risk? The decision to come to Lagos had not been easy. Pride argued against it. Fear amplified every doubt. But something inside her insisted she see this woman with her own eyes. She wanted no formal introduction, no rehearsed politeness. She wanted truth. She wanted to understand who would stand beside her son when life stripped away appearances. So she came alone, unannounced, carrying nothing but resolve and the weight of expectation. Sitting by the roadside felt like returning to the margins she knew too well, a position that revealed character without pretense. She braced herself for disappointment but hoped, quietly, for grace. When the crowd gathered and attention sharpened, she felt the test begin. And as the first cruel gesture landed, how much more could silence endure without becoming surrender? Mama Ruth's silence was not weakness. It was strategy shaped by years of survival. She understood how quickly a mother's intervention could become a burden, how easily love could complicate a child's path. She believed that if her son saw this moment, he would carry it forever. And so she held her tongue, absorbing the humiliation, choosing pain over interference. Her body ached, knees stiff against the road, but her resolve held. She focused on breathing, on remaining present, on protecting him from a truth that might wound deeply. But silence has a cost, and endurance can only stretch so far. The crowd mistook her restraint for permission, for submission. And as whispers grew sharper, who would pay the price for this unspoken choice? Memories surged again. Of nights spent waiting for him to return safely, of prayers whispered into darkness, of hands laid gently on his head in blessing. Those memories fortified her now, wrapping around her like a shield. She reminded herself why she came. Not to be seen, not to be saved, but to know. The test was cruel, but it was honest. Each second of silence stripped away illusion, revealing character with brutal clarity. She wondered, briefly, whether love required her to endure this moment or to end it. The line between sacrifice and self-erasure blurred, and as the air thickened with anticipation and a familiar presence edged closer, was the moment of revelation finally at hand? When she sensed him near, Mama Ruth did not turn immediately. She steadied herself first, grounding her emotions, preparing for consequences she could not control. She knew the truth would hurt him, knew it would fracture something precious. But truth had its own gravity, pulling everything toward exposure. Her silence had carried the weight long enough. The city seemed to pause with her, noise receding, attention narrowing. She lifted her eyes slowly, meeting the distance with calm acceptance. And as footsteps closed in and the space between past and present collapsed, one question pressed against her heart. How would a son respond when the cost of silence was finally revealed? Laughter returned in short, jagged bursts, bouncing off the buildings like loose stones as the crowd leaned closer and fed on the moment. Power had shifted hands without anyone noticing, slid quietly into Vanessa's grip because she stood tall and spoke loud. In Lagos, volume often passes for authority. She sensed it and leaned into it, shoulders back, chin lifted, letting the attention warm her like sunlight. The old woman's stillness became a backdrop, a prop in someone else's performance. People smiled not because it was funny, but because smiling felt safer than questioning. Shame spread through the air, invisible but heavy, settling on the kneeling figure while lifting the one who caused it. In that instant, humiliation felt communal, shared, normalized. But power built on crowds is fragile. It sways with mood, with fear, with truth. And as the laughter thinned and eyes darted uneasily, who would the crowd turn on when the mood finally broke? Vanessa fed on the attention, mistaking noise for agreement and silence for consent. She gestured sharply, words cutting through the air, her confidence swelling with every nod and chuckle. Pride wrapped around her like armor, blinding her to the tension rippling beneath the surface. She believed dominance required spectacle, that control had to be visible to be real. The crowd obliged, offering reactions instead of resistance. Phones stayed raised. No one stepped forward. In that vacuum, cruelty felt justified, even necessary, as if the moment demanded it. The old woman's dignity stood in quiet contrast, amplifying the ugliness without a word. Vanessa didn't notice the contrast. She was too busy proving herself. But pride has a way of narrowing vision, of turning warnings into background noise. And as unease crept into the circle, what crucial detail was she failing to see? Gossip threaded through the onlookers, quick and sharp, transforming the scene into currency. Someone whispered a guess. Someone else added a judgment. Stories formed without facts, feeding curiosity and absolving conscience. The old woman became an object, an anecdote to be shared later, a lesson twisted to fit convenience. Vanessa stood at the center, basking in the sense of command, unaware that gossip cuts both ways. It lifts before it tears down. The same mouths that laughed now weighed possibilities, recalculating loyalties in real time. Public shame is fickle. It loves momentum more than truth. As murmurs grew louder, the air thickened with anticipation, the crowd sensing that something was about to tip. And as Vanessa's pride sharpened her words further, how quickly could admiration sour into judgment? Heat pressed down, sweat beading on foreheads, tempers tightening with the humidity. The old woman shifted slightly, knees protesting, and the movement drew fresh attention. A few faces softened, discomfort flickering behind practiced indifference. Someone cleared their throat. Another looked away. The mood wavered, uncertain which direction to lean. Vanessa felt the hesitation and responded with more force, mistaking restraint for weakness. She stepped closer, voice firm, posture commanding, reclaiming the moment through volume. The crowd's indecision hardened into compliance. No one wanted to be the first to object. Shame thrives on that pause, on the fear of standing alone. Yet even as control seemed secure, the ground beneath it trembled. And in that charged stillness, who would dare to break the spell? The city sounds pressed back in, horns blaring, vendors calling, generators humming. Yet the circle remained sealed, insulated by attention. Vanessa's confidence peaked, intoxicated by the sense of dominance that came from being unchallenged. She believed this moment would fade like all the others, absorbed by the city's endless appetite for distraction. The old woman's silence, however, began to work against her, drawing sympathy she could not control. Eyes lingered longer now, studying posture, noting restraint. A crack formed in the narrative. Vanessa dismissed it, unwilling to acknowledge the shift. Pride whispered that retreat would look like defeat. But pride is a poor advisor when truth waits nearby. And as the crowd's focus drifted, how long could she hold their allegiance? A hush rippled outward, subtle but unmistakable, as movement at the edge of the circle drew attention. Heads turned in unison, curiosity overriding cruelty. Vanessa felt it then, a loss of command, a slipping grip. Irritation flared, sharp and defensive. She pivoted slightly, ready to reclaim the spotlight, unaware that the spotlight itself had moved. The old woman remained still, eyes calm, as if anchored to something deeper than the crowd's approval. The contrast unsettled everyone watching. Power began to feel borrowed, conditional, seconds from recall. And as anticipation tightened like a drawn string, who would the moment choose to elevate or destroy? Public shame is a mirror, reflecting not just the victim but everyone who participates. The crowd sensed it now, the uncomfortable awareness creeping in as the balance shifted. Vanessa stood rigid, pride stiffening her posture, while the old woman's composure quietly redefined strength. The city seemed to lean inward, waiting for resolution. A single truth hovered, heavy and inevitable, ready to drop and shatter the fragile hierarchy. And as the circle tightened and the air held its breath, one question demanded an answer. When power collapses in public, who pays the price first? A door clicked shut behind him, soft but final, as Ethan Cole stepped away from the black SUV and into the heat of the afternoon. The sun struck his face, sharp and unfiltered, and the noise of Lagos rushed back in waves, horns, voices, engines, but his attention tunneled forward, pulled by something he couldn't yet name. He hadn't planned to stop here. His day had been mapped, meetings stacked, time measured in minutes. Still, instinct had tightened his chest when he saw the crowd, had told him to slow, to look again. He moved closer, footsteps steady, eyes scanning the circle for context, for reason. Laughter hung in the air, brittle and wrong. Then he heard it, a voice low and controlled, shaped by years of restraint. His stride faltered. Memories surged like heat through concrete. That cadence, that calm. His pulse quickened as recognition brushed the edge of certainty. And as he crossed another invisible line toward the crowd, what truth was he about to walk straight into? The crowd shifted to make space without knowing why, bodies responding to the gravity of his presence. Ethan noticed the kneeling figure at the center and felt a pressure behind his eyes, a familiar ache blooming where old memories lived. He told himself it was coincidence, that cities recycle faces and voices endlessly. Still, his steps slowed, each one heavier than the last. The smell of wet earth reached him, sharp and metallic, and his gaze dropped to the muddy water pooled on the ground. His jaw tightened. He traced the line of the woman's posture, straight back despite the road, composed despite attention, and something inside him recoiled. He had seen that posture before, late at night, early in the morning, in moments shaped by sacrifice. The city noise dulled, replaced by a hum in his ears. And as his breath caught, how long could denial protect him from recognition? Ethan stopped at the edge of the circle, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the woman's hands as they wiped her face slowly, deliberately. That motion pierced him, precise and devastating, carrying years of memory in its simplicity. He remembered those hands tying his school uniform, steadying him when fear crept in, counting change with care. The crowd blurred. Heat pressed in. He felt suddenly young, small again, standing on the edge of understanding. His chest tightened with a mix of dread and certainty. He wanted to step back, to undo the last few seconds, to preserve a version of reality that didn't demand action. But the moment refused to release him. The woman lifted her head slightly, and the light caught her features just enough. His breath stuttered. There it was, the truth he had been circling. And as his heart slammed against his ribs, what choice would recognition force him to make? Vanessa's voice cut through the haze, sharp and confident, pulling Ethan's attention forward. He saw her clearly now, her stance, her ease, the casual authority with which she occupied the space. The contrast struck him like a blow. He had known this woman as composed, generous, careful with her words. He had trusted the version of her presented in quiet rooms and curated moments. Seeing her here, framed by laughter and mud, jarred his senses. He felt anger flare, hot and immediate, followed by something colder, betrayal. The distance between who he believed she was and who she appeared to be widened painfully. He searched her face for doubt, for restraint, for any sign of hesitation. He found none. The realization settled heavy in his chest. And as the crowd watched for his reaction, how much of his future was unraveling in real time. Ethan took another step forward, the crowd parting instinctively, eyes flicking between him and the kneeling woman. The old woman's gaze lifted fully now, meeting his with a calm that both steadied and shattered him. There was no accusation in her eyes, no plea, only recognition and quiet acceptance. His throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to bridge the distance with words, but his voice lodged somewhere between anger and grief. The city felt distant, unreal, as if the moment existed in its own sealed space. He became aware of his own body, the tension in his shoulders, the heat on his skin, the weight of every eye. This was not a private reckoning. This was public, irreversible. And as silence stretched, would he protect the truth, or the image of the life he had planned? Vanessa finally noticed him, her expression flickering from irritation to surprise, then to something like calculation. Ethan saw it all, the quick adjustments, the practiced composure snapping back into place. She straightened, ready to explain, to perform. He felt the urge to stop her rise in his chest, a need to control the narrative before it swallowed him whole. But the moment had already slipped beyond control. The crowd leaned in, sensing revelation. Ethan's attention returned to his mother, to the mud drying on her skin, to the silence she had chosen. Guilt surged, sharp and unforgiving. He realized how far absence could stretch, how easily love could become distance. And as his resolve hardened, what line would he draw between who he was and who he refused to become? Ethan inhaled deeply, grounding himself against the storm of emotion, and took one final step into the center of the circle. The city seemed to pause with him, breath held, waiting for impact. His presence altered everything, the hierarchy, the story, the stakes. Vanessa's confidence wavered. The crowd's curiosity sharpened into anticipation. The old woman remained steady, eyes soft but unyielding. Ethan felt the weight of generations press against his spine, the lessons he had been taught rising to meet the moment. And as his mouth opened to speak, the question burned brighter than ever. Would truth finally be named, or would silence claim another victim? The mud had already begun to dry, cracking gently on fabric and skin, but its weight lingered far beyond what the eye could measure. Ethan stood frozen, eyes fixed on the stains that spread across his mother's wrapper like scars with no intention of fading. The crowd saw dirt. He saw history. Every night she stayed awake, every road she walked barefoot so he could ride buses, every humiliation she swallowed without complaint. The air felt heavier now, charged with a truth that pressed against everyone present. The city's noise returned in fragments, distorted, as if reality itself struggled to process what had just happened. This wasn't just a mess to be cleaned. It was an exposure. Something sacred had been dragged into public shame, and Ethan felt the rupture deep in his chest. He realized then that some acts do not end when they are done, they echo. And as the crowd waited, uncertain how to breathe, who would be forced to answer for this stain? Ethan's gaze lifted slowly from the mud to Vanessa's face, searching for recognition, for regret, for any flicker of awareness. What he found instead was tension, tight lips, alert eyes, a posture bracing for negotiation rather than accountability. The difference cut sharply. He felt something settle inside him, heavy and irreversible. Love built on trust cannot survive willful blindness. The moment demanded clarity, not excuses. He glanced back at his mother, who stood quietly, hands folded, dignity intact despite the spectacle. Her silence spoke volumes, amplifying the cruelty, without adding a word. The contrast between them, restraint and entitlement, etched itself into his understanding. The crowd sensed the shift, murmurs rising as people recalculated allegiances. The story they thought they were watching had changed shape. And as Ethan took a breath to steady himself, how much truth could one moment hold before it shattered everything? Vanessa tried to reclaim the moment with movement, stepping forward as if proximity could restore control. Ethan felt the impulse to block her, to create distance where none had existed before. He noticed the mud on her shoes now, the unintended evidence of involvement, and the symbolism struck him hard. Power leaves marks. Choices reveal themselves. The future, he had imagined, polished, seamless, admired, felt suddenly fragile, built on assumptions he had never tested. He remembered conversations about values, about kindness, about the kind of family he wanted to build. Those words echoed hollowly now. The crowd leaned in, sensing confrontation, sensing drama. Ethan's chest tightened with the awareness that this reckoning would not remain private. And as Vanessa's confidence faltered just enough to show strain, what version of her would finally emerge under pressure? The old woman shifted slightly, a small movement that drew Ethan's attention back to her. She adjusted her wrapper again, smoothing fabric with practiced care, as if reclaiming herself piece by piece. That simple act grounded him, reminding him of what endured beyond appearances. He felt anger flare, not loud, not explosive, but controlled and focused. This wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries, about refusing to let cruelty define the future. He recognized the temptation to soften the moment, to choose convenience over confrontation. But the image before him refused compromise. The mud, the silence, the crowd, all of it demanded a response equal to the harm done. And as the air tightened around him, would he rise to meet that demand, or retreat into comfort? The crowd's energy shifted again, anticipation sharpening into expectation. People whispered Ethan's name now, recognition spreading like a slow wave. Respect mixed with curiosity, altering the dynamic completely. Vanessa felt it too, her posture stiffening as she realized the ground beneath her was no longer solid. Ethan stood between them, between past and future, aware that whatever he did next would define more than this moment. He felt the weight of legacy pressed down, the knowledge that silence here would speak louder than any defense later. The city seemed to lean inward, waiting. And as the seconds stretched, what cost would truth demand from him? Heat pressed against Ethan's skin as he finally moved, positioning himself closer to his mother, subtly but unmistakably. The gesture drew a collective breath from the crowd. It was not dramatic, not loud, but it carried meaning. Alignment. Protection. Vanessa noticed, her eyes narrowing, calculations racing behind them. Ethan felt resolve settle into his bones, calm and unyielding. This was not a negotiation. The mud had crossed a line, one that separated who he loved from who he trusted. He understood then that some revelations arrive not as words, but as actions witnessed. And as the crowd absorbed the shift, how quickly would perception turn into judgment? The silence that followed felt heavier than the laughter that had come before, thick with implication. Ethan stood anchored beside his mother, the future narrowing into a single point of decision. Vanessa's certainty unraveled thread by thread, exposed by the stillness. The crowd sensed the impending fallout, curiosity tinged with discomfort. The city's rhythm resumed around them, indifferent yet complicit. One truth hovered, undeniable and ready to be spoken aloud. And as Ethan drew breath to break the silence, the question burned brighter than ever. What happens when love collides with legacy in full view of the world? Silence dropped like a curtain, sudden and complete, swallowing the last echo of laughter as Ethan stepped fully into the open. The sun caught his face, outlining him against the restless city, and every eye snapped toward him at once. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He stood there, shoulders squared, breath steady, letting the moment settle into its own gravity. The crowd leaned forward, sensing a turn they hadn't paid for but couldn't avoid. The old woman remained still at his side, mud drying on her skin, posture calm, as if she had been waiting for this exact alignment of bodies and truth. Vanessa felt the air change and froze, confidence hanging by a thread. The city's noise thinned to a distant hum. In that charged stillness, who would speak first, and who would be exposed by what was said? Ethan's gaze moved deliberately from the faces in the crowd to the woman beside him, lingering there with unmistakable tenderness. He took a breath, grounding himself, then shifted his stance just enough to be seen clearly standing with her, not over her. The symbolism landed before any words did. Whispers rippled outward, quick and electric. Someone gasped softly. A phone trembled in a raised hand. Vanessa's eyes flicked between them, confusion sharpening into alarm. The old woman's calm presence seemed to anchor the space, her silence lending weight to the revelation about to come. The crowd sensed it too. This wasn't a defense. It was a declaration. And as anticipation tightened around them, how far would truth reach once it broke free? When Ethan finally spoke, the effect was immediate and devastating, his words slicing through the heat with clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. He named the relationship without flourish, without anger, simple, undeniable. The old woman was his mother. The statement landed like a shockwave, rippling through the circle and beyond. Gasps erupted. Faces rearranged themselves in real time, surprise, shame, awe, regret. The crowd recoiled, instinctively creating space where there had been none. Vanessa's posture collapsed inward, the confidence she wore shedding like a brittle shell. The beggar, transformed instantly in the public imagination, elevated by bloodline and sacrifice. The city watched as truth redefined the hierarchy in seconds. And as the echoes of recognition settled, who could claim innocence now? Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed, words scrambling behind her eyes. She searched the crowd for support and found only distance, curiosity curdling into judgment. The old woman did not gloat. She did not speak. She simply stood there, dignity restored not by applause but by truth. Ethan remained steady, his presence unyielding, signaling that this revelation was not a performance, but a boundary. The crowd shifted again, energy reversing direction, shame finding new targets. Phones lowered. Eyes averted. A few people murmured apologies that never quite reached their lips. The city had witnessed the reveal, and there would be no rewinding it. And as Vanessa's reality fractured, how would she survive the truth she never prepared for? The transformation of the moment was brutal in its speed. The same faces that laughed now measured their own complicity, recalculating where they stood. Respect surged toward the old woman, awkward and overdue, while suspicion pooled around Vanessa's feet. Ethan felt the weight lift slightly from his chest, replaced by a sober clarity. This wasn't victory. It was correction. The story had been wrong, and now it was righted. The city resumed its noise, but the circle remained altered, carved by revelation. Every person present understood that something irreversible had occurred. And as the crowd absorbed the consequences, what price would public truth demand next? Ethan turned his body fully toward his mother, offering support without spectacle, his arm a quiet shield at her side. The gesture sealed the moment. Alignment became visible, unmistakable. Vanessa's breath quickened as she realized the future she counted on was slipping away, unraveling under the gaze of strangers. The crowd leaned back now, spectators to fallout rather than spectacle. The old woman's eyes softened briefly, meeting Ethan's with gratitude and resolve, a lifetime of sacrifice acknowledged in a single look. The city bore witness, and as judgment settled into the air, who would be strong enough to carry it? A hush followed, heavier than before, as the implications spread beyond the circle and into memory. This was no longer a roadside incident. It was a story that would travel, reshaped by retelling but anchored to truth. Ethan stood firm, knowing the line had been drawn where it needed to be. Vanessa faced the crowd she once commanded, now stripped of certainty. The old woman remained steady, her silence finally understood. And as the moment teetered on the edge of consequence, one question pressed forward with relentless force. When truth stands exposed before everyone, who will karma choose to answer first? The shift was immediate and unmistakable, like a sudden change in weather that everyone feels but no one controls. The crowd that once leaned toward Vanessa now leaned away, bodies angling subtly as if distance could erase their earlier laughter. Eyes that had sparkled with amusement hardened into scrutiny. Whispers sharpened, names and judgments passing from mouth to mouth with unsettling speed. Karma didn't arrive loudly or dramatically. It arrived with cold precision, rearranging the social order in seconds. Vanessa felt it in the way space opened around her, in the silence that followed her movements. The old woman, now recognized and respected, stood calm at the center of it all, proof that dignity could outlast humiliation. Ethan watched the transformation unfold, aware that consequences had their own rhythm. And as the air thickened with judgment, who would feel its weight first? Vanessa attempted to recover, adjusting her posture, smoothing her clothes, reaching instinctively for the composure that had always saved her. But this time, the performance fell flat. The crowd no longer mirrored her confidence. They studied her instead, searching for cracks. Respect had drained away, replaced by curiosity and doubt. A few people shook their heads. Someone scoffed under their breath. The same energy that once lifted her now pressed down, heavy and unforgiving. Public opinion is a fickle force, and Vanessa felt it turn against her with unnerving speed. She realized too late that power borrowed from crowds demands constant repayment. And as murmurs grew louder, how much of her carefully built image could survive this reversal? Ethan sensed the weight of the moment settle deeper, the realization that truth does not simply expose, it reorders. People approached his mother now with hesitant respect, offering space, offering assistance that moments earlier had been unthinkable. The contrast was stark, almost cruel in its clarity. He felt a mix of relief and sorrow watching it happen. Relief that truth had spoken. Sorrow that it required humiliation to be heard. His mother accepted none of the attention, remaining composed, her silence dignified. Karma, he understood, wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. The scales were adjusting, slowly but decisively. And as the crowd recalibrated, who would be left standing when the dust settled? Vanessa's isolation became complete, a visible gap forming around her as if she were marked. She noticed it, felt it seep into her bones, replacing certainty with fear. The laughter that once surrounded her felt distant, almost mocking in memory. She searched for allies and found only strangers. The realization cut deep. Without applause, she had little to stand on. Pride curdled into defensiveness, then into something like panic. Karma does not negotiate, does not soften its impact. It moves when the moment is ripe, indifferent to preparation. And as Vanessa's world narrowed to the circle of eyes upon her, what refuge remained for someone exposed in public? The city resumed its relentless pace around them, indifferent to individual downfall, yet the circle held, frozen by consequence. Ethan remained beside his mother, his presence a quiet statement of allegiance. He felt the temptation to intervene, to diffuse the moment, but resisted it. This reckoning belonged to truth, not comfort. The crowd's attention lingered on Vanessa, dissecting every movement, every expression. She had become the lesson. The reversal was complete. From admired to admonished in a matter of minutes. And as the city watched karma unfold, how far would its reach extend beyond this moment? Vanessa's breath came faster now, chest tight, eyes darting as if searching for escape routes that no longer existed. The reality of public shame settled heavily, stripping away pretense. She felt exposed, smaller, reduced to the very vulnerability she once mocked. The irony burned. Karma has a cruel sense of symmetry. Ethan watched without satisfaction, aware that this was only the beginning. Consequences rarely conclude in one scene. They ripple outward, touching futures, reshaping plans. And as Vanessa's confidence crumbled, what part of her life would be claimed next by this unfolding justice? The air cooled slightly as clouds drifted across the sun, shadows lengthening and deepening the sense of finality. The crowd's whispers softened into a low hum, the verdict understood without being spoken. Ethan felt the moment lock into memory, an irreversible marker in all their lives. His mother stood tall, her endurance finally acknowledged, while Vanessa faced the cost of her choices alone. Karma had arrived without mercy, precise and unyielding. And as the city breathed on, one question lingered, heavy and unresolved. Was this the end of the reckoning? The first tear slipped free before Vanessa realized she was crying, warm against her cheek, cutting a clean path through the makeup she had trusted like armor. Her shoulders dipped, posture folding inward as the weight of the moment finally broke through denial. The crowd watched closely now, attention sharpened by reversal, curiosity replacing cruelty. Vanessa's breath came uneven, chest rising and falling too fast, as if air itself had become scarce. She reached out instinctively, hands trembling, searching for something solid in a scene that no longer belonged to her. The city's noise pressed in again, louder than before, amplifying her vulnerability. She lowered herself slowly, knees bending toward the same ground where humiliation had just played out. The symmetry was impossible to miss. And as she knelt, eyes glossy and desperate, who was she begging now, for mercy or for escape? Her words tumbled out quickly, overlapping, stripped of the polish she once wielded so effortlessly. Apologies spilled into the air, raw and unfiltered, carrying the sharp edge of fear rather than understanding. She reached toward Mama Ruth, stopping short as if unsure whether touch would help or harm. The crowd leaned in, hungry for redemption as spectacle, measuring sincerity like currency. Ethan watched silently, jaw tight, aware that remorse often arrives only after consequence. Vanessa's voice cracked as she tried to explain, to contextualize, to soften the act that could not be undone. The ground beneath her knees felt unforgiving, mirroring the reality she faced. And as her apologies echoed, what could forgiveness possibly look like after such public harm? Mama Ruth remained still, eyes lowered, hands folded neatly in front of her, absorbing the scene without reaction. Her silence was not cold, it was careful, weighed down by years of wisdom. She understood regret well, had lived long enough to see it bloom too late in many hearts. She felt the pull to comfort, the instinct to ease pain, but held it back. Some lessons require space. The crowd noticed her restraint, tension tightening as they waited for a response. Ethan felt the ache of the pause, knowing that forgiveness offered too quickly could erase accountability. The city seemed to hold its breath with them. And as Vanessa's pleas grew more frantic, would compassion answer? Or would silence speak again? Vanessa bowed her head, shoulders shaking now, the full weight of public shame settling into her bones. She realized how exposed she felt, how fragile her carefully built identity had been all along. Pride had abandoned her, leaving only fear and regret in its wake. She searched Mama Ruth's face for softness, for any sign of absolution, and found only calm. The absence cut deeper than anger ever could. Ethan felt torn, witnessing the collapse of someone he once trusted while standing firm beside the woman who raised him. He understood then that forgiveness is not a transaction. It is a process, earned slowly, sometimes never fully granted. And as the crowd waited, who would decide what justice looked like here? A murmur rippled through the onlookers, some expressing pity, others judgment, the collective unsure how to resolve the discomfort. Redemption stories are easy when harm is small. This was not small. The humiliation had been public, deliberate, cruel. Vanessa's apologies collided with that reality, bouncing off the memory of laughter and mud. Ethan felt the urge to step in, to manage the moment, but resisted. This was not his pain to erase. Mama Ruth's silence held the center, redefining power once again. The city watched uneasy, aware that not all wounds close neatly. And as the tension stretched, could remorse undo what choice had already set in motion? Vanessa lifted her head slightly, eyes swollen, voice softer now, stripped of urgency and edge. Something genuine flickered there, recognition, perhaps, of the harm done. It came late, but it came. The crowd sensed it too, the shift from fear to awareness, and leaned back, uncertain how to respond. Mama Ruth inhaled slowly, grounding herself, feeling the weight of generations in her chest. She knew forgiveness carried responsibility, not just for the offender, but for herself. Ethan watched her closely, understanding that whatever happened next would define the moral center of the story. And as Mama Ruth finally stirred, would grace enter the space, or would consequence hold firm? The moment hung suspended, heavy with expectation, as Vanessa remained kneeling, stripped of certainty and applause. Mama Ruth's silence stretched one last time, deliberate and instructive, forcing everyone present to sit with the discomfort. Forgiveness, when it comes, must be chosen, not forced by tears or pressure. The city breathed around them, indifferent yet complicit, bearing witness to a reckoning still unfolding. Ethan felt the future narrow again, shaped by whatever response emerged from this pause. And as Mama Ruth prepared to break her silence, one final question burned in the air. Can regret rebuild what cruelty shattered, or is some damage meant to stand as a warning forever? Ethan shifted his weight, the movement small but decisive, placing his body fully between his mother and the kneeling woman before him. The gesture carried more meaning than any speech could, a quiet alignment that settled the air like a verdict. The crowd noticed immediately. A line had been drawn, not with anger, not with drama, but with certainty. Ethan felt the steadiness of it in his chest, the way clarity replaces chaos when a choice is finally made. He glanced down at his mother, meeting her eyes, and saw there neither demand nor expectation, only trust. That trust pressed heavier than guilt ever could. He straightened, shoulders squared, aware that the future he once imagined was slipping away, replaced by something harder but truer. And as the crowd leaned in, would loyalty finally speak louder than love? The city's noise surged and softened again as Ethan took a breath and faced Vanessa, his expression calm but closed. There was no cruelty in it, only distance, measured, intentional. He felt the pull of memory tug at him, shared plans, quiet laughter, promises made in private spaces. Letting go of those visions hurt in a way that surprised him, sharp and immediate. But beneath the pain lay resolve, forged long before this moment, shaped by the woman standing beside him. He remembered lessons about respect, about humility, about how love should never require silence in the face of harm. Those lessons anchored him now. He realized that choosing his mother was not rejection, it was alignment with the values that made him who he was. And as Vanessa searched his face for hope, what answer would she find reflected there? Vanessa's breathing quickened as understanding settled in, her pleas thinning into disbelief. She sensed the shift, the finality in Ethan's stance, and the truth landed with brutal clarity. This was not a pause. This was an ending. The crowd felt it too, the collective realization that the story had reached its hinge. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not explain himself. He didn't need to. His presence beside his mother said everything. The simplicity of it stripped away argument, leaving no space for negotiation. Public choices demand public courage, and Ethan felt the weight of eyes on him, measuring his resolves. And as Vanessa's certainty collapsed into despair, how does one accept a future that closes without appeal? Mama Ruth reached out then, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm, grounding him, steadying the moment. The touch carried decades of reassurance, a reminder that he was not alone in this choice. She lifted her gaze to the crowd briefly, acknowledging their presence without seeking approval. Her dignity reframed the scene once more, shifting focus away from drama and toward principle. Ethan felt a swell of emotion rise, gratitude, grief, pride, braiding together in his chest. This was the cost of integrity, he realized, the willingness to lose what you want to protect what matters. And as the crowd absorbed the quiet strength of that bond, who could deny the power of a love that demanded nothing in return? Vanessa lowered her head, shoulders slumping as the finality settled in, the future she planned dissolving under the weight of consequence. The crowd's whispers softened, curiosity giving way to reflection. Some looked away, unwilling to watch the end of a dream unravel. Ethan remained still, resisting the urge to soften the blow, understanding that clarity was kinder than false hope. He felt sorrow for what might have been, but no regret for the choice itself. The line between compassion and compromise had never felt clearer. And as silence stretched again, what kind of strength does it take to walk away without hatred? The city resumed its rhythm in fragments, horns blaring, footsteps passing, yet the circle remained intact, suspended by the gravity of Ethan's decision. He glanced once more at his mother, seeing relief flicker across her face, brief but profound. That moment affirmed everything. He knew the path ahead would not be easy. Loss rarely travels alone. But he also knew it would be honest. The crowd sensed the resolution settling in, the story shifting from confrontation to consequence. And as Vanessa remained kneeling, stripped of illusion, what lessons would she carry from this public reckoning? Paragraph 7. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight lift just enough to breathe, and turned his body fully toward his mother, signaling the direction of his future. The crowd parted instinctively, making space as if acknowledging the choice. This was not a victory lap. It was a commitment. He took a step forward with her, leaving behind the scene that had defined the day. The city swallowed them into its motion, but the moment remained etched in memory. And as they moved away together, one final question lingered, quiet and enduring. What does it truly mean to choose love when love demands courage? The invitations lay untouched on a glass table in a quiet apartment that evening, edges crisp, names printed in careful script, futures promised in ink that suddenly meant nothing. The room felt too clean, too orderly, as if it had missed the memo that everything had changed. Outside, Lagos moved on, cars honking, lights blinking, lives colliding, but inside, time slowed to a heavy crawl. Ethan stood by the window, city lights reflecting faintly on the glass, realizing how quickly certainty can evaporate. Just hours earlier, the wedding had felt inevitable, a fixed point on the calendar. Now it hovered like a ghost, present only in absence. He breathed in, steadying himself, aware that endings don't always announce themselves with noise. Sometimes they arrive quietly, leaving you to name them. And as he turned away from the window, what future would rise from the silence left behind? News traveled fast, reshaped by whispers and retellings, carrying fragments of truth through neighborhoods and phones. By morning, the story had already grown legs. Some softened it, others sharpened it, but the core remained. A wedding halted. A choice made. People debated morality over breakfast, dissecting actions they never lived. Public judgment is relentless, but Ethan felt strangely removed from it now, anchored by clarity rather than opinion. He knew the city would forget soon enough. Spectacle fades quickly here. What mattered was what stayed. He checked on his mother, finding her calm, reflective, neither triumphant nor broken. She moved through her space with the same quiet dignity, as if the world had simply realigned itself. Watching her, Ethan understood that closure doesn't always require ceremony. And as the city buzzed with speculation, which truths would endure once the noise settled, Mama Ruth returned to her routines with gentle determination, rising early, tending to small tasks that stitched days together. She spoke little of the incident, choosing reflection over repetition. Her silence no longer carried burden, it carried peace. Ethan noticed the change immediately, the way her shoulders seemed lighter, her steps steadier. He realized then that being seen, even briefly, can restore something lost over years. The humiliation had not defined her. The response to it had. She reminded him, Without words, that dignity survives exposure when rooted in self-respect. He felt gratitude swell, tempered by sorrow for what had been lost. Life, he learned, rarely offers clean resolutions. And as he watched her move through the morning light, what lessons would he carry forward from this reckoning? Vanessa faded from their lives with the same speed she had once commanded attention, her presence replaced by memory and consequence. The city offered her no script for recovery, only space to reflect. Some said she left Lagos for a while. Others said she stayed and learned. Ethan did not chase the answers. He understood now that accountability does not always arrive wrapped in redemption. Sometimes it simply asks you to sit with the truth you avoided. He felt no satisfaction in her fall, only a sober acceptance that choices shape outcomes whether we intend them to or not. The wedding plans dissolved quietly, venues canceled, calls made, deposits lost. Each small administrative act felt like another layer of closure. And as those ties loosened, what new direction would his life take without the future he once envisioned? Time did what it always does, moved forward, indifferent yet healing. Weeks passed. The story receded from conversation, replaced by new distractions. Ethan returned to work, to routines, to responsibilities that demanded focus. Yet something fundamental had shifted. He noticed it in how he listened, in how he watched people treat those with less power. The roadside moment had rewired his attention, sharpening his awareness of character in quiet spaces. He felt a deeper resolve to live intentionally, to align actions with values rather than appearances. Love, he realized, was not proven in grand gestures but in everyday choices. And as the city offered him countless paths, which one would reflect the man he had chosen to become? One evening, as the sun dipped low and the city softened into gold, Ethan walked beside his mother through a busy street, their pace unhurried. People passed them without recognition, and that anonymity felt like relief. They shared silence comfortably now, no longer weighed down by what had been unspoken. He felt grounded, connected to something older and steadier than ambition. The road stretched ahead, uncertain but open. He knew challenges would come. Loss leaves its own echoes, but he also knew he would face them anchored in truth. The city's lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the path forward. And as he glanced at his mother, walking strong at his side, what could be more powerful than a future built on integrity? The wedding never happened, but something more enduring took its place, a lesson carried quietly into countless moments yet to come. How you treat the powerless reveals who you truly are. The story settled there, not as spectacle, but as warning and wisdom intertwined. The city moved on, but the truth remained, etched into memory and choice. Ethan and his mother disappeared into the flow of Lagos, their bond unbroken, their path clear. And as the screen fades and the audience is left alone with their thoughts, one final question lingers, steady and unavoidable. When the moment comes, what will your choices say about you?